So, what do you want me to do?
So could you take us around some of your old work spots and tell us some of those stories about what you worked with?
Yeah. My name is Ellenore Foulis. I qualified as a solicitor in 1979 and did a lot of work involving family cases and a lot of work involving children. I finished working as a safeguarder in, I think, 2015, and that essentially was when I retired from doing any of the work that I had principally been doing.
And in 2015, what sort of started that process? What sort of started you beginning to retire, I suppose?
So this area is another area that I used to regularly visit. But one of the most frightening experiences of my whole professional life happened here. So I was involved in having to visit a flat along here in Ann Street one day, an old flat, an old tenement flat, and I had to go because we were really concerned about what was happening for the children in this particular family. We were quite sure that the mother was working as a prostitute, but there was no evidence of it, but there was a suspicion that the mother was working as a prostitute. There also were serious concerns with regard to drinking and the lack of care of the children. So I can remember going, and I went unannounced, and I wanted to go after school time, and I deliberately wanted to go unannounced so I could find out what actually was going on. And I can remember going in through the door, one of these doors along further back along the road, because the tenement building is still there, and no lights were working. I can remember the door swung closed and the whole place was in darkness. I remember going up 2 flights of stairs and my knees absolutely shaking, because I thought, this is so dangerous, this is just going to be such a horrible place to be visiting. But I needed to find out what was going on with the kids. So I knocked on the door, thinking to myself and saying to myself, just man up, just be brave here. And I got in, and in fact what was going on was that all the children at 4:30 were in this one room. A whole lot of little children. I can't remember how many of them there were, but they were all
20, how many?
Oh, I mean, maybe between 5 and 10 children. They were all in this room. And in the other room, which was the living room, I think the children were all in the bedroom, and in the other room, which was the living room, there were a whole lot of men who were basically just using it as a drinking den. The mum wasn't there. I don't know where she was, but she wasn't there. And all these drunken guys were in this other room. And I spoke to the children for a little while, and I saw how awful the situation was. I mean, I saw for myself how lacking in care, how awful the situation was for these kids. And just as I was leaving, the mother returned. She'd actually been at one of the shops in the hill town buying more drink. And I remember before I went to the children's hearing, in connection with these children, by which time the father had received a copy of the report, he had contacted the reporter and said that he was going to kill me. So the police had been contacted so that they would attend the children's hearing, because he was going to knife me. I had been told that this is what he was threatening to do, so I was aware of that, but I was going to the hearing anyway. But there was a warrant out for his arrest anyway for outstanding criminal matters, so he didn't turn up to the hearing, so that was fine, and the children were removed. The sad thing about it is that I remember seeing one of those girls long after this. I mean, she would have been a little girl maybe of about 5 or 6 at that time. I mean, she herself became a drug addict. She herself became a prostitute. She herself had 2 little children, and she herself used to stop me from time to time when I was still working. I would sometimes see her about 9 in the morning in Dundee, and she would come up trying to get money from me, not recognising me, not knowing who I was. So, I mean, it was really sad. Things did not turn out well for her.
Did you ever point out that you knew her?
No, never. That was, I forgot to tell you about when I got chased up the hill town. So I was involved with a boy who lived in one of those walk-ups. I think it was Carnegie Square. And I can remember going to see this boy one summer's evening. There were all these children who were setting fire to bins. And this was just, you know, in this area round about here. And because you had to be quite careful in the hill town, I mean, it was not necessarily the best of, it wasn't the best of areas here. And because it's not the best of areas, and because I was really being quite cautious and quite careful for my own sake, I hadn't brought my car along to where I was visiting. I didn't want them to know what my car looked like. So I had parked further up the hill, and for some reason they had decided that I was a police woman. So they decided that I was a pig. So that's what they were calling me, a pig, and they were snorting at me as they were setting fire to their bins. And what they then did was they started to chase me. So I just hot foot ran up the hill, got my car, jumped in my car, and drove off. So that these kind of situations would happen quite regularly. You know, it was just not pleasant, but that sort of situation would happen on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you one thing. So sort of going back to, you mentioned all those kids not really having anything, like doing a lot, like, you know, doing this criminal action, smashing windows and everything. And maybe it's a strange question to ask, isn't it? But why do you think they did that? Why do you think they didn't have?
Well, there were no restraints on them. Their home lives were really pretty chaotic. In a lot of cases, their parents weren't together anymore, and in some of the cases, the mums took up with different men. So there were, you know, different men coming into the household, being the head of the household. Often there then was violence within that household, and that relationship broke up, and another similar kind of relationship started. So the kids would take themselves out of the house to get away in a lot of circumstances. But also in many cases, the male figures coming into the house had criminal propensities. Sometimes they would take the kids along with them. I mean, quite a lot of the kids that I was involved with through the children's panel, and sometimes through the courts, would be taken along by their fathers or father figures to help break into houses, because they could get in through small windows. I mean, they weren't being told that it was wrong to behave like that. It became a way of life. It was just something that they did. I mean, I'd have to say, I do think they knew it was wrong, because I mean, they wouldn't be going to school and necessarily talking freely about the activities that they got up to at school. But they didn't think it was so wrong that they shouldn't be speaking to me as a curator or as a safeguarder. They didn't think it was so bad that they shouldn't be talking to me about it. It was just, that's just what they were going to be doing. That would be their way of life. That's what they'd be getting up to.
And that still happens?
I don't know, because I don't work with these folk anymore, but I can't think of any reason why that would have changed in any way. I mean, you have social workers who work with families, you have charities that work with kids, to try and give them activities to do, keep them occupied. There's actually a place called the Grey Lodge Settlement. My daughter-in-law's mother, through the Roman Catholic Church, is actually involved with the Grey Lodge Settlement. And I mean, there are in the hill town, there are countless groups, private charities that help families in all manner of different ways. But it's an overwhelming problem. I mean, there aren't enough resources, and by that I mean there aren't enough people working for these groups. There isn't enough money available to pay them. There isn't enough money to have as many activities as they would like to be having, because they can't afford to pay the staff to run the facilities, or they don't have the money to actually have these places that they used to run the facilities still open, and places have closed down. But there are lots and lots of charities that try and help. But I think in the current financial climate, I mean, the impoverished are very poor, very, very poor, very needy, and the numbers of very poor, very needy people increases all the time. And if you don't have any money, and you don't have a job, and you don't have much hope, you're going to be utterly miserable. You may well turn to drugs, you may well turn to drink. Less and less are your kids your priority. They are just like, a necessary encumbrance, if I can put it that way. But they're actually not your priority in terms of care. And I do believe that when you look back at what happened in Victorian times, when you look at what happened with the gin parlours and the drunken mothers and, the kids hanging around the doors of pubs and so on, or drinking dens, there is a similarity between what goes on now. I met this family worker, child and family worker. She said to me that on more than one occasion she had gone to see a family, and as she went in the door, on the lintel up above the front door into the property was a samurai sword. Now, I never personally saw that. I saw baseball bats and I saw reinforced front doors, but I never saw a samurai sword. And one of the last court cases that I was involved in as a curator, I remember coming up to visit a man here, and he was a strange fellow. And this was one of these circumstances where, when you were involved in these kind of court cases, you started off with a little bit of information, and then the more information you acquired, the more you're required to dig deeper, and you got more and more appalling information about what these people who were seeking contact with their very small children had done, and exactly why you couldn't recommend they have any kind of contact of any type with any of these children. The difficulty would be, in a lot of these cases where I was involved as a curator, to do a report for the court where one parent had raised a court action against another, was that you would come to the conclusion that actually the best thing for the children concerned would be to not be with anybody within the family. And in those kind of circumstances, what I regularly would do would be, I would refer the case to the children's panel. Then the children's reporter would just not proceed any further and nothing would happen. There does come a point where you feel that you are that lone voice calling in the wilderness. You would go to children's hearings and you would have made lots of inquiry, you would have a report that you'd prepared with lots of information, you would be making imaginative and intelligent recommendations and giving options, and they wouldn't be followed through.
To play devil's advocate here, do you think you ever made the wrong call?
I don't believe I did, because I mean, I am not saying that I'm infallible. I do not honestly think that on any occasion when I was making a recommendation about what should happen, it was a recommendation that should not have been followed. But, you know, nobody has to follow or had to follow what I was saying. And on occasions when recommendations weren't followed and decisions were made, my view sometimes was these were very bad decisions, these were wrong decisions. Sometimes I would appeal them. Sometimes I would think there is no point appealing this because I'm going to get absolutely nowhere with it. And so, yes, out of total frustration, I decided I wasn't going to work as a safeguarder anymore, because my conclusion was and remains that the children's panel isn't fit for purpose. And that's just my opinion.